Right, we're going to start, though, with some breaking news. The ECB has just announced what it's going to do to tackle the racism, sexism and class-based discrimination that was identified as being deep-rooted in a damning report from the Independent Commission for Equity in Cricket in June. We'll go through the plans for you in just a moment, but let's start, though, with this statement from the ECB chair, Richard Gould. He said this: "On the day the ICEC published its report, I apologise without reservation on behalf of cricket's wider leadership to anyone who suffered discrimination or felt excluded from our sport." As well as reiterating that apology here, I reaffirm our absolute commitments that cricket will strive to become the most inclusive sport in England and Wales. Cricket hasn't got it right in the past, but this is an opportunity to move forwards together. I urge everyone to now come together, to put their energy and effort into delivering these actions and to playing their part in ensuring cricket becomes England and Wales's most inclusive team sport. Well, I'm delighted to say our reporter Rob Jones joins me now to go through the specifics. Remind us of the context, though, that's led us to where we are now.
Well, as you just mentioned, it was a report that was published in June, an independent report entitled "Holding Up a Mirror to Cricket," and the reflection was pretty ugly and unpleasant as far as the English game is concerned. Racist, sexist and elitist were the key headlines to come out of it. There were more than 4,000 respondents, including the England Test captain Ben Stokes and the England women's captain Heather Knight. But of those asked, 87% of Pakistani and Bangladeshi respondents reported to experiencing racism, 82% of Indians, and the report also said that it had failed a generation of black cricketers. Women were treated as subordinate to men at all levels, and there was also prevalence of elitism and class-based discrimination. As you mentioned there in the quote, the statement from the ECB that we had, there was a full and frank apology at the time from Richard Thompson, but today there has been, I guess, more details on what the ECB plan to do about it.
Talk us through what they've actually committed to and how far these commitments will actually go.
Well, let's start with ethnically diverse communities, shall we? Because I guess the reason that English cricket was forced to have this soul-searching was largely to do with everything that happened at Yorkshire and the allegations made by Azeem Rafiq. These are some of the things they say in terms of Black and South Asian inclusion within their report to develop Diverse Communities Action Plan, the ACE programme and the South Asian Cricket Academy. They'll invest more than £2 million into that. But as for Azeem Rafiq himself, he sort of had 2 points about his experiences at Yorkshire. One of those was what he experienced, I guess, the face-to-face discrimination, that there was this, the report describes it as a laddish, misogynistic culture within dressing rooms. The ECB have said today that all 18 professional counties have been through training in terms of the culture. But the other big problem that he had was what happened when he went with his complaints to his county. They weren't listened to, they weren't acted on properly. Well, now the ECB are going to bring in this independent regulator. There is already a disciplinary commission. There will now be a regulator. So if you have concerns, you go there. It's a central unit, not managed by the counties. So there are a couple of things that the ECB are looking to try and do to tackle this discrimination. Is it going to be enough to stop what happened to Azeem Rafiq happening again? This is how he responded when we asked him a little bit earlier on.
I just don't think any of that's been tackled strongly enough. I mean, we've seen instances this year, recently. The one positive is that it seems like it's more likely to be reported. But, attitudes and this stuff does take time. So, I do understand that this stuff's not going to change overnight. But we've seen instances this year, even when the ICEC report came out, there were instances. We were contacted from people that, felt like that their teammates were basically discrediting the report. So I think attitudes have not changed enough.
So when we heard the graphic that heard from Azeem Rafiq there was a graphic beforehand where we talked about the money being invested into things like the African Caribbean Engagement Programme, the South Asian pathways as well, because that was part of the problem. It's not just face-to-face discrimination, it's also the problem. How do you get more black cricketers and young South Asian cricketers into playing in the professional game? And the ECB saying today, look, pathway-wise, on the boys' side, the number of young South Asians playing the game and then going on to sort of academy levels is good. The next step is how we get them into playing professional cricket. And it's also an issue for young black players. And you think back to someone like Michael Carberry, one of the last black players born in England to play international cricket, the likes of Chris Jordan and Jofra Archer, born in Barbados. So how do we improve that? And things like the ACE programme should be significant in doing so.
OK, what about the commitments to the women's game then, and also getting it more accessible to people from lower income backgrounds and state schools as well?
Well, let's tackle the women first, because financially was one of the biggest problems and the biggest differentials found by the ECB report. And it said that women were paid an embarrassingly small amount compared to the men. Well, financially, there will be a £25 million investment above the forecasted revenue to try and grow the women's and girls' game.
That's a huge commitment, isn't it?
That's a massive commitment when you think that at the moment the revenue that's coming into the women's game is just over £10 million, around £11 million. It's a £30 million commitment up until the end of the broadcast deal, which ends in 2028. They're trying to grow the game in terms of commercially, both with new sponsors and in terms of a new broadcast deal, which will hopefully cut that gap a little bit. The other point is fees and pay and wages. Already at the end of last month, they confirmed that the match fees internationally for England's women would be the same as the men. That took over during the recent series against Sri Lanka. Part of the ICEC report, as you can see on your screen, suggested that domestically the pay should be equal by 2029, internationally by 2030. The ECB said that can't be done in those timescales. As for class, a lot of discussions about how you get more people into cricket, more children into cricket. There's an increase in hardship funds, kit funds, travel funds. But again, the ECB have said today, look, we can't make cricket free for every single participant, but we're doing what we can. We're doing what we can to make it played more in schools, but also provide as much financial support for those families who maybe can't go out and afford all that kit, because cricket is a very expensive game compared to something like football or rugby.
I'm always amazed to say, and I'd say this is more probably a statement than anything, but the fact that salaries aren't the same across a sport that's, you know, ultimately they're both playing exactly the same sport, and they're getting a lot less. That always quite amazes me. There is some significant money being committed here. Where is that all coming from then? Is it coming from the men's game then? Or?
Well, that is the interesting question as to where the money comes from. And that was a question I asked directly to Richard Gould when we were on a briefing with the ECB a little bit earlier on. He said, look, Claire Connor said, we've costed this all up. It's tens of millions of pounds. And there was a lot of, I guess, what you'd call business jargon. We're balancing the business. We're reprioritising. We're looking to grow our commercial revenues, which is what I said to you, particularly about the women's game. And also went on to say, we don't see this as a cost, but as an investment. It is something we had to do. When you see a report from the ICC, which was that stark, that used some of the language that we did, something had to be done about it pretty quickly. But also, and this is really interesting, I thought it was almost chucked in towards the end as a side point by the ECB, but it's really interesting. Loads of money needed for things like tackling racism and sexism and elitism. But he also said, we need to guard against our best players going off into franchise cricket. It's a massive problem around the world. We see it with, I guess, what you'd call more minor than England, test-playing nations, that some people are ripping up central contracts. We've even seen it with some of New Zealand's best players. Take someone like Trent Boult, for example. I'll go and get my money from franchise cricket, because they're offering huge sums at things like the IPL, and that's only growing around the world. So, yes, the ECB will need to invest more in things like this, but they're also wary that franchise cricket might be coming to someone like a Ben Stokes or a Joss Butler and say, tell you what, be a franchise player, don't be a centrally contracted England player anymore.
Goodness me. Just finally, Rob, how will they measure their success in this? When will we be looking back at this and saying, actually, they've got it right now?
I think that's really difficult because how do you measure it, particularly with, I guess, something like ethnic diversity, other than going maybe down the road of quota systems? You can't say we must have X amount of South Asian players or X amount of black players within an England team or a county team by a certain date. That isn't realistic. So I guess the criticism of people will say, this isn't clear enough, this isn't measurable enough. How do you... You've asked the question, which is the same question that has been asked to the ECB this morning, that there is no... In certain ways, there is no clear way. Other parts of the plan do have set dates if we want to be doing this by this time, but there are certain points that we've covered which... I guess you have to annually or regularly hold the ECB to account and say, why haven't you done this yet? Or why isn't this better?
All right, Rob, as always, brilliant stuff from you. Thank you.